It was the autumn of 1942, and Europe was burning. It was the dead center of the war. At the heart of the horrors in Western Europe was an unlikely accomplice. It was a railway company. The French National Railway, officially known as the SNCF, powered the Holocaust. The Nazis gave the orders, but the SNCF supplied everything else, including the tracks, the schedules, and the cattle cars. But somewhere inside this cold mechanical system was a man who shouldn't have stood out, but somehow did. His name was Marcel Hoffmann. To anyone watching, he looked like the perfect cog in the machine, obedient, invisible, and part of the system that kept the trains of death moving on time. But history has a way of hiding its most unexpected rebels in the unlikeliest places. And to understand why Marcel Hoffmann mattered at all, you have to understand the world he was trapped inside. Because the SNCF was beyond a railway company. It was the circulatory system of occupied France, and by 1942, it wasn't simply moving passengers or freight. It had become the logistics arm of the final solution. Between 1942 and 1944, the SNCF transported approximately 76,000 Jews from France to the death camps. 76,000 human beings, men, women, children, all crammed into cattle cars, 50 to 100 bodies per car, with no water, no mercy. The trip to Auschwitz took 3 days. Many died en route. Those who survived the journey walked straight into the gas chambers, and all of it ran on a chilling system of invoices and timetables. The SNCF was paid per passenger per kilometre at the rate of a third-class ticket. Even children under 4 travelled a bureaucratic courtesy that still charged for their deportation to death once they turned 5. The company even billed the German Reich for the return trip of the empty cars. But here's the twist. The Nazis couldn't run this system on their own. They didn't have the expertise or the manpower. They needed the French railway workers to volunteer their skills, to show up to work, to throw the switches, couple the cars, and drive the locomotives. And thousands of French railway workers did exactly that. Not because they were threatened, but because it was their job. The Vichy government was France's puppet regime under Marshal Pétain at the time, and they had made collaboration official policy. It was French police who carried out the infamous Vel d'Hiv roundup in July 1942, arresting 13,000 Jews, including 4,000 children. For 5 days, those families were trapped inside a cycling stadium with no food, no water, and no toilets before being loaded onto trains. French trains, driven by French engineers, to transit camps where they waited for the final journey east. The SNCF's headquarters kept clean records of the route schedules, the car allocations, maintenance logs, and the invoices. The deportation trains were given a bureaucratic designation called transport de politiques, a cold euphemism for cattle cars full of doomed civilians. These trains were given priority over everything except German military transports. Food shipments could wait. Medical supplies could be delayed. But the deportation convoys ran on time. Marcel Hoffmann knew all of this. He worked in the Lille railyard, which was one of the major hubs in northern France. Trains from Paris heading to Belgium and beyond passed through Lille. And by the autumn of 1942, many of those trains began to carry human cargo. Marcel was 34 years old. He had spent 12 years with the SNCF, and his job was simple but critical. He was a switchman who controlled the rails themselves. It was a role that required precision. One wrong switch could derail a locomotive and send a train down a dead-end siding. In wartime, mistakes weren't just dangerous, they were fatal. A switchman who caused trouble could easily end up in front of a firing squad. Marcel, however, caused no trouble. He was good at his job, quiet, methodical, and reliable. He followed every order, arrived on time, and avoided attention. In the rigid hierarchy of the SNCF, he was the perfect worker. But there was something about Marcel that made him different. Something nobody paid attention to at first, but that would become the key to everything. His name, Hoffmann. It was a German surname common in Alsace-Lorraine, that borderland tugged back and forth between Germany and France for generations. His grandfather had been German, his father French. Marcel himself grew up fully French, speaking flawless Parisian French with no hint of a German accent. But his name sounded like the enemy's. And in 1942, appearances were everything. But no one at this point realized Marcel had something far more dangerous than a German-sounding surname. He had a secret. While his colleagues showed up to work, coupled the deportation trains, and collected their paychecks, Marcel was watching. He was remembering every schedule, every route, every convoy that passed through his railyard, carrying people to their deaths. And he was doing something that no one suspected the quiet, obedient switchman would ever do. He was planning an act of defiance so insane, so impossible, that if it failed, it wouldn't just get him killed, it would get dozens of others killed alongside him. The Lille railyard was an industrial maze of steel and smoke. Dozens of tracks crisscrossed each other like veins on the back of a hand. It was loud, it was chaotic, and in that chaos, it was possible for things to go wrong. The Germans controlled the railyard, but they didn't run it. That was the fatal flaw in their system. They relied on the French railway workers to keep the trains moving. German soldiers patrolled the perimeter. SS officers inspected the paperwork. But the actual work was done by Frenchmen, men like Marcel. The deportation trains came through Lille on a regular schedule. They arrived from Paris, stopped briefly for refueling or crew changes, and then continued north toward Belgium and eventually toward the east. The cattle cars were sealed shut, locked from the outside with heavy iron bolts. Inside, people pressed against the wooden slats, gasping for air, begging for water. Sometimes you could hear them. Most of the railway workers learned not to listen. But Marcel listened. He learned the schedules by heart. He knew which trains carried civilians and which carried soldiers. He knew which convoys had extra guards and which did not. And most importantly, he knew the one thing that the Germans didn't. He knew that a single man with the right knowledge and the right moment could throw a wrench into the entire machine. But knowledge wasn't enough. Defiance required opportunity. And in the autumn of 1942, opportunity arrived in the form of a transport convoy that would change everything. October 15th, 1942. It was a cold, grey morning. Marcel arrived at work at 5:30 a.m., as he did every day. He checked the day's schedule posted on the board in the switchman's shed, and that's when he saw it. Convoy 42, scheduled departure, 14 hours. The destination was Malines, Belgium. From there, the train would continue to Auschwitz. But this transport felt different. Marcel had seen the preliminary paperwork the day before. This convoy was carrying children, some as young as 4 years old. They had been rounded up from hiding places across northern France, like orphanages, convents and farmhouses. The Vichy police had been systematic and ruthless. The children were being held in a converted warehouse near the railyard, guarded by a handful of German soldiers and French gendarmes. They were scheduled to board the train at noon. Marcel stared at the schedule. His hands were steady, but inside, his heart broke. He had watched dozens of convoys pass through. He had looked away. He had told himself there was nothing he could do, that resistance was suicide. But this was different, and for the first time in his life, Marcel decided that being invisible wasn't enough. He folded the schedule and put it in his pocket. He walked out of the shed into the fog. And he began to do something he had never done before. He began to look for the fatal flaw in the system, not to fix it, but to exploit it. Less than a kilometre away from the warehouse was a squat brick building that had once stored grain. But now it stored people. The children had been brought there the night before in trucks, rounded up from across the region. They were mostly Jewish children whose parents had already been deported or killed. Some had been hidden by Catholic families, by farmers, by strangers who had risked their lives to protect them. But the Vichy police had informants. They had lists, they had orders, and they had found them. The oldest among them was 14. They all sat on the cold concrete floor of the warehouse, huddled together for warmth. The German soldiers stood guard outside. Inside, 2 French gendarmes paced, rifles slung over their shoulders, eyes avoiding the children's faces. And as Marcel walked past the warehouse and heard the silence inside, he made a decision. A stupid, impossible, suicidal decision. He was going to stop Convoy 42. He didn't know how yet, but he knew he was going to try. And if he failed, the punishment wouldn't just be death. The Nazis don't execute saboteurs. They made examples of them. They tortured them in public, hung them in town squares, and killed their families. But none of that mattered anymore. Because Marcel had just decided to become the one thing the system couldn't tolerate. He had decided to become a problem. And at that exact moment, somewhere else in the railyard, a life hung in the balance. His name was Oskar Jacques Stultsaft. He was 7 years old. And on the morning of October 15th, 1942, he stood on the platform of the Lille railyard, holding a small cloth bundle that contained everything he owned, a change of clothes, a worn stuffed rabbit, and a photograph of his parents. Oskar had been separated from his mother and father 3 weeks earlier. They had been hiding in the attic of a farmhouse outside the city when the Vichy police came. His father had pushed him through a small window at the last second, told him to run, to hide in the woods. And Oskar ran and hid. But a farmer found him 2 days later, cold and starving, and believing he was doing the right thing, turned him over to the local gendarmes. Now Oskar stood on the platform with 62 other children, waiting for a train he didn't understand. The German soldiers had told them they were going to a work camp in the east, that they would see their parents again soon. But Oskar wasn't stupid. He had seen the way the guards looked at them, not with hatred, but with indifference, like they were cargo, not children. Oskar had stopped crying days ago. Tears didn't help. They just made the other children more scared. So he stood silent, clutching his bundle, his eyes following the movement of the railway workers across the yard. One worker in particular caught his attention. The man kept glancing toward the children, then looking away quickly, as if the sight hurt him. The man's name was Marcel Hoffmann, and he was about to do something that would save Oskar's life. Over the previous months, Marcel had been cautious, testing his fellow railway workers, not with grand speeches or recruitment drives, but with small comments, subtle questions. Most workers avoided the questions. They looked away, but a few met his eyes. Those few became his crew, and they were 24 men in total. Switchmen, engineers, mechanics, freight handlers. Most were French, a few were Belgian. They were all railway workers who decided they had seen too much. They didn't call themselves a resistance cell, because they had no name and no formal structure. And on the morning of October 15th, when they saw Convoy 42's passenger list, they decided it was time to act. The plan, if you could call it a plan, was insane. It had more holes than a Swiss cheese and relied on luck. But first, they needed time. They needed the train delayed. And they needed someone willing to walk up to an armed German soldier and lie to his face. At 11:45 a.m., 15 minutes before the children were scheduled to board, Marcel walked across the platform toward the German guard post. His heart was hammering so hard he could feel it in his throat. In his pocket, he carefully folded his SNCF identity card. Because it bore his name, Marcel Hoffmann. The guard was a Wehrmacht sergeant, not SS, which was important. The regular army soldiers were generally less fanatical, more interested in getting through their shifts than in ideological purity. But he was still armed. He still had orders. And if Marcel said the wrong thing, or hesitated for even a second, the sergeant would know something was wrong. Marcel approached the guard post. The sergeant looked up from his clipboard, annoyed at the interruption. Marcel didn't speak German well, but he didn't need to. He simply held out his identity card and tapped his own last name, Hoffmann, letting his voice take on a softer, more Germanic tone as he introduced himself as someone with German family roots from Alsace. The change in the sergeant's expression was immediate. It wasn't warmth. German soldiers rarely bothered with warmth in occupied France. But it was something less hostile, a flicker of curiosity. He inspected Marcel's identity card more closely, repeating the surname, processing the implications. Alsace-Lorraine was a region the Nazis considered inherently German, even when political borders disagreed. Anyone with a German-sounding name from that territory instantly became more valuable in their eyes, a small victory for their racial mythology. Marcel leaned into that myth with calm confidence, presenting himself as the kind of occupied subject the Germans liked to imagine existed. Someone who resented the Vichy government, viewed French collaborators as traitors, and felt a lingering loyalty to the Reich through bloodline. It was a lie crafted with precision, and it worked. The sergeant's suspicion eased, replaced by the satisfaction of believing he had found a sympathetic ear. Marcel used that moment to shift the conversation. He pointed toward the locomotive assigned to pull Convoy 42 and reported a supposed mechanical issue, a faulty coupling mechanism on the third car. If left unaddressed, he warned that it could derail the train. The sergeant's irritation returned instantly, but so was the fear of being held responsible for a preventable disaster. When the sergeant demanded a time frame, Marcel offered 20 to 30 minutes, insisting he needed to begin immediately if the 14-Stube departure time was to be maintained. He emphasized that the risk was the sergeant's to carry if he blocked the inspection. The hesitation that followed was brief but crucial. The sergeant weighed discipline against self-preservation, and self-preservation won. He allowed Marcel the time he asked for, instructing him to report back as soon as the inspection was complete. As Marcel stepped away, he caught sight of his crew across the platform, who appeared to be moving about their normal duties. While Marcel walked toward the train, pretending to inspect the coupling, the rest of his crew moved like ghosts through the railyard. 3 workers, Henri, Claude and Jean-Paul, approached the platform where the children waited. They were dressed in standard SNCF coveralls, carrying brooms and buckets. Henri approached the cluster of children and spoke to them in a low, urgent tone. He instructed them to listen carefully and explained that some of them would soon follow him. When he pointed to a child, that child was to rise slowly and walk toward a storage shed about 50 meters away, partially hidden behind a stationary freight car. He emphasized that they must not run or look frightened. They were to move as if they were simply going to use the toilet. A few of the older children nodded, understanding immediately. Oscar, still clutching his small cloth bundle, didn't grasp every word, but he recognized the seriousness in Henri's voice. This man was trying to help. Henri then selected 12 of the smallest children, those who could be moved more quickly and attract less attention. He pointed to Oscar among them. The chosen group stood up as instructed and began to follow Claude, who carried a bucket to maintain appearances. To any casual observer, it looked like a routine escort to relieve themselves. The German guards posted near the warehouse entrance barely registered the movement. When the children reached the shed, Jean-Paul was already there. He slipped inside first, opened the door quietly, and ushered them in one by one. The interior was dark and cramped, cluttered with old tools and spare equipment, but it held one vital feature, a second concealed door at the back that opened onto a narrow service alley behind the main railyard buildings. Jean-Paul instructed the children to stay silent and wait. He closed the door, leaving them in the safety of darkness. Back on the platform, Henri turned toward the remaining children. He selected the next small group with a subtle gesture and guided them in the same direction, repeating the quiet choreography of escape. This time, 8 children, then another 6, then 7 more. Each group moved slowly and naturally, as if they were simply being escorted to facilities. The guards grew accustomed to the sight. It became routine, just railway workers managing the logistics of 63 prisoners before a long journey. By 12:30 p.m., 41 children and adults had been moved off the platform. They were hidden in 3 different locations: the storage shed, an abandoned signal house at the edge of the yard, and a coal bunker that hadn't been used in months. The operation should have been impossible. It should have been noticed immediately. But the fatal flaw in the German system was the same flaw that had made the Holocaust efficient: the assumption that everyone would follow orders, that no one would dare to resist. The Germans trusted the system. They trusted the paperwork and the routine. They trusted that French railway workers who had been complying for months would continue to comply. And that trust was their weakness. But Marcel's crew had just driven a railway spike straight through it. At 13:45, 15 minutes before departure, the sergeant came looking for Marcel. The coupling inspection should have been finished by now. The train needed to leave. Marcel was standing beside the locomotive, grease smeared across his coveralls, a wrench hanging loosely in his hand. When the sergeant approached, he lifted his head with the measured concern of a man who knew exactly how to sound competent without appearing threatening. He explained that the coupling was cracked and if the train departed as scheduled, it would fail long before reaching the Belgian border. A derailment, prisoners escaping into the countryside, would destroy careers, and the sergeant knew it. Panic flickered across his face. He demanded a solution, and Marcel supplied one. A replacement car from the secondary yard, and a process that would require 2 full hours. The sergeant protested, fixated on the schedule, but Marcel reminded him that schedules meant nothing if the train never arrived. After a tortured moment of calculation, the sergeant relented. He ordered the repair completed by 6:00 and stalked off, already crafting excuses for the delay. Only when the officer disappeared from sight did Marcel move. He slipped behind a freight car where Henri was waiting, tension carved into his features. Henri reported the count. They had 41 children hidden, 22 still exposed on the platform. The numbers hit Marcel like a blow. Saving 41 was a miracle, but leaving 22 behind felt like a wound. He pushed the grief aside and issued instructions. The hidden children had to be moved out through the north side service entrance, where only one guard, unreliable and frequently asleep, stood watch. They needed to leave in small groups, blending in with the flow of workers heading out for lunch. Once outside, they would be dispersed among safe houses across the city, never more than 2 or 3 in any single home. Henri absorbed the plan, then slipped into the sprawling railyard, vanishing between the tracks and warehouses to shepherd the children towards safety. Marcel remained where he was. Over the next 3 hours, while Marcel stalled the departure with invented mechanical problems, his crew moved 41 souls out of the railyard and into the city. At 16:15, Convoy 42 finally departed Lille. It carried 22 children instead of 63. The German guards never noticed. They counted the remaining prisoners, confirmed the numbers matched their adjusted paperwork that Marcel had corrected to account for administrative errors. The train travelled to Malines, Belgium, then on to Auschwitz. All 22 children who remained on that train were murdered in the gas chambers within hours of arrival. But 41 lived. Some went to the workers' own homes. Others were taken to trusted friends, to Catholic families and farmers on the outskirts of Lille who had already been hiding refugees. Oscar ended up in the home of Claude Bertrand, one of the railway workers. Claude had 3 children of his own, all under the age of 10. His wife, Marie, took one look at the terrified 7-year-old with the cloth bundle and wordlessly prepared a 4th bed. Oscar lived with the Bertrand family for the next 2.5 years, hidden in plain sight. He was introduced to neighbours as a cousin from the countryside and went to school under a false name. Oscar's parents never came back. They died in Auschwitz in the spring of 1943. But Oscar survived. He grew up. He became a teacher. And in 2020, when he was 85 years old, he stood in a ceremony in Jerusalem and spoke about the railway worker named Claude Bertrand, who had saved his life. But he also spoke about the man he barely remembered, the quiet man with the dark hair who had been inspecting a train on the platform that day. The man whose name he only learned decades later was Marcel Hoffmann. But Marcel Hoffmann never spoke about what he did. After the war, when France was celebrating its liberation and rewriting its history to emphasize resistance and minimize collaboration, Marcel stayed silent. He went back to work for the SNCF. He kept his head down. He collected his pension. He raised his children. And he never once claimed to be a hero. Most of his crew did the same. They had saved 41 lives, but they had also worked for the SNCF throughout the occupation. They had seen other convoys pass through. They had been part of the machine, even as they sabotaged it from within. That moral complexity haunted them. How do you celebrate saving 41 when you couldn't save the thousands who came before or after? For decades, the story remained buried. The SNCF didn't want it told. It raised uncomfortable questions about why more railway workers hadn't resisted. The French government didn't want it told because it complicated the narrative of national resistance. Even the survivors, scattered across France and beyond, didn't know the full story. They knew they had been saved, but they didn't know all the names of their rescuers. It wasn't until 2010, more than 60 years later, that a historian named Georges Ribeil began investigating the Lille rescue while researching the SNCF's wartime record. He found fragmented records, located survivors, interviewed the few remaining family members of the railway workers. And slowly, he reconstructed what had happened that October day in 1942. Marcel Hoffmann had died in 1987, at the age of 79, never knowing that history would eventually remember him. On January 27, 2020, International Holocaust Remembrance Day, Yad Vashem, Israel's Holocaust Memorial Authority, announced a posthumous honor. Marcel Hoffmann was named Righteous Among the Nations, the highest honor Israel can bestow on non-Jews who risked their lives to save Jews during the Holocaust. He was the first of the Lille railway workers to receive the honor. In the years since, 8 more members of his crew have been recognized. The process continues. Historians are still identifying participants, still locating descendants who can verify the stories. At the ceremony, Oskar Stultsaft, now an old man himself, stood beside Hoffmann's granddaughter and gave a speech that captured the entire paradox of the story. He spoke of how Marcel had worked inside the very system built to destroy people like him, how he had been part of the machinery of the deportation trains, and yet had used that same machinery to save lives. And, he said, the world needed to understand that even within the darkest machine, there were still individuals who chose humanity over obedience. Marcel Hoffmann did his job. But he also did something else. He remembered that before he was a cog in a machine, he was a human being. And 41 people who were scheduled to die lived to see liberation because one man decided that keeping the trains running on time was less important than keeping his humanity intact. If you've followed us this far, don't let it end here. Hit subscribe, share this, and help bring more untold stories of World War II out of the shadows.